All right, everybody. We are starting today on archaeology. Archaeology is probably, I don't know, I would say it's the most popular anthropology that people know about. It's the one where they dig up stuff, right? So that's kind of like the most famous one. If you watch Indiana Jones, Tomb Raider, those guys are supposed to be archaeologists, all right? Um, so yeah, let's get started. Before we get started, though, please read. Please be sure to read and watch our material. When I say read, I mean specifically the PowerPoints. Look, I know this is you have a lot of things going on. If you can read the material, read it. But I really want you to pay attention to the PowerPoints and the lectures. Those two are going to save you when it comes to answering the questions. I'm going to ask questions specifically related to the lecture. So please, keep that in mind. Please make sure to complete this week's quiz and reflection. Nothing new there. Um, the only tips I have for the reflection is just use information from this class. Please don't use anything from Wikipedia, and make sure it's 600 words. Okay, I'm not trying to kill you with work, but it needs to be done this way. All right. And like always, if you have any questions, just shoot me an email at raymond.fong@kvcc.cu.edu. All right. Great. So the question I want you to think about in this lecture is archaeology is largely about understanding our past. So, what are some of the obvious difficulties that arise in trying to investigate the past? Think in practical terms, right? So, just think about if you were trying to, like, you don't even have to know anything about anthropology. Think about just trying to figure out anything about the past. Like, what makes it difficult, right? So, let's say you're trying to figure out something about your great great grandmother. How would you find that out? What steps would you take, and what would make it difficult? Okay. So, let's get into what archaeologists do. Archaeologists analyze material traces of human activities. They analyze the modification of the physical environment. They use the archaeological record to interpret cultural diversity and change. They provide illumination on past forms of human culture that do not exist today. This is pretty straightforward, right? Material traces of human activities, that's pretty straightforward. Just anything that people leave behind. Modification of the physical environment is very interesting, right? Um, So like technically, there would be no trace if we made, I don't know, a campfire, right? But or no, not a campfire. Oh, like a mountain. You know how we dig tunnels? That'd be a modification of the physical environment, right? And it wouldn't necessarily be a material trace because it's not material, obviously, but it's a modification to the environment that we're in. Okay. Um, archaeological record. We'll talk about that next. And provide illumination on past forms of human culture that don't exist today. So that's the main thing, right? So really, archaeology is about understanding the past. That's pretty much what it is, okay? But from a more cultural perspective, right? When you start getting into the more scientific stuff, that's when you're going into more bioanthro, right? If you start thinking about, oh, what's the composition of, of bones, of humans in this period of time, whatever. There's more of the scientific stuff that goes into bioanthro. Archaeology is more about how did our ancestors live, right? So like, you know, did they have a language? Did they have a market? Did they have a religion? Did they, whatever, right? That's really what archaeology is about. Okay. All right. Approach. Reconstructing the past, reconstruct life ways of the past, explain cultural processes that create their culture, and focus on interpretive archaeology. So when we talk about cultural processes that create their culture, we're talking processual archaeology. We're focusing on interpretive archaeology. We're talking about post-processual. We're going to go over those two in a second. But again, reconstructing the past, that's very important, right? So we're not just trying to figure out what we were, what we were doing, but more importantly, what uh, what like what was our maybe like day-to-day life kind of. I know it's really impossible to answer, but it's still the goal. Okay. Now, processual archaeology views archaeology as an objective empirical science. This side of archaeology uses mathematics to examine distribution of material remains over space and time, and it emphasizes human adaptation to different environments. Yeah. So, um, when we're talking processual, right, and post-processual, these two are kind of like same sides or different sides of the same coin. So realistically, in reality, you can't have one without the other. But we break this down for the sake of learning, right? So this is using math and kind of hard science to understand things about our ancestors. So what that looks like is like, oh, hey, these people were, 1 kilometer away from the river, they must have a fishing method. Or because they're one, whatever, however many feet away from the river, they had certain building types to prevent flooding, right? These are things that are kind of math and hard science related. Post-processor archaeology emphasizes human agency and the power of ideas and values in studying past cultures. They stress symbolic and cognitive aspects of societies. They examine power, domination, internal contradiction within a society from archaeological record. So this is really about, let's see. This is really about, I'm trying to think of a different word to say, but basically the culture of the time, right? So this is more of like, oh, hey, we found this wagon and this road. Does that mean that they had like a market every week, right? Or we found that there are these types of coffins. Does that mean they had a special kind of burial, ritual? Who knows, right? So anyways, that's what post-processual is all about. It's examining the culture of the society. Okay. And again, like I said, even though we're explaining these two as two separate things, they're really two sides of the same coin. Okay. All right. So archaeological record. The archaeological record consists of 4 things, which is artifacts, ecofacts, features, and sites. Artifacts are portable objects made, used, or modified by hominins, right? So this is probably the easiest thing to think about, like pots, pans, knives, helmets, clothes, yeah, right. Yeah, it's shoes, whatever, right? These are artifacts. Ecofacts are plant or animal remains that are byproducts of hominid activities. So, for example, if we found a bunch of chicken bones in one place and they were eaten by humans, that means that would be an ecofact, right? Or we see the skeleton of a dog that we domesticated, very important that we domesticated. That would be the byproduct of a human hominid activity, right? So that would also count. Now, we'll talk about it later, but there's a big difference, right? If you find a dog that's been domesticated, right? Because domestication means that the dog is what? It's a product of hominid activities. Then you could use that as a, you could use that as part of the archaeological record. However, if you are finding a wild dog or a wolf, would that count as an ecofact? No, right? Because it doesn't have anything to do with humans, essentially. Okay. Okay. Features are non-portable remnants of hominid activities such as walls, ditches, or mounds. So features and artifacts are essentially the same, but features can't be moved, right? So like the examples here, walls are a good example, right? Bridges are a good example. Statues, most statues, the big statues. The good example I always like to give is a graveyard, right? Because graveyards, what are you gonna do? Like, transport the whole plot of land? You can't do that, right? So that's literally unmovable. It's not portable. Okay. And finally, sites. Sites are just the geographic location with the remains of past activities. So basically, it's where you find the stuff. Okay. All right. Preservation. This is very important. So preservation. What factors go into the preservation of the archaeological record, right? Is the thing organic or inorganic? What lasts longer in the ground? Something that's organic, like an apple, or something that's inorganic, like a stick or a piece of metal, right? Obviously, the piece of metal or the stick. Okay. Very cold, wet, or very cold, dry, or wet climates are also beneficial to preserving the archaeological record, right? So cold, dry places like Siberia, places like Alaska, right? Cold and dry. Could be just dry by itself, like Arizona. Arizona is a great place for the archaeological record. In fact, I think they're one of the top universities for studying Native Americans because it preserves so well over there, right? For archaeology because it preserves so well over there. And finally, wet climates, right? Wet climates like Florida, maybe San Francisco. Yeah, those types of places. Those are places that would also, maintain it pretty well. Places that wouldn't maintain it very well is places like New York, not just because it's a city, but because it's kind of humid, but not that humid. It's kind of hot, but not that hot, so it's kind of stuck in the middle. It's hard on the archaeological record. Okay. Also, going back to the example of Siberia, it is no surprise that Siberia is actually the place where they find the most what are those old mammoth tusks, because Siberia is so cold, right? So good preservation. Okay. The last thing is transformational processes. This includes cultural and natural factors. Cultural factors are things such as looting or construction, right? Construction is easy, right? You find something in the ground, but guess what? There's a Walmart that's about to be built there. You're gonna be screwed. Looting looks like, hey, I found some stuff and it's kind of valuable. I found some king's, grave, and it has a bunch of jewels and stuff, and someone wants to steal it. Well, that's how that goes, right? Let's see, what else? Natural factors, right? Animal activities and natural catastrophes. If you ever seen a dog dig, you ever seen gophers dig into the ground? Like, I mean, gophers cause people with gardens of that. Imagine if you had some of the archaeological record in your dirt, it'd be gone for sure. Okay. Oh, how does this complicate the research of the past? Why? Just because we can't find it doesn't mean it didn't exist, right? A lot of things will break down and it won't look the same as it did back then, or it might not even. Yeah, So it really confuses us in terms of like what it was for, when it was made, so on and so forth. All right, so how do we find sites? How do we find archaeological records, right? Now, there are four main methods, right? Let's talk about the first one, which is pretty easy. Interviews, right? Interviews. Sometimes you'll talk to somebody and they'll have like a story, and they'll be like, oh, like, person, my great grandma used to play here, and she said that there used to be a lake, and you're like, oh, word, there used to be a lake here? Okay, right? And so you can maybe find some stuff around that area. Okay. Maps. When I say maps, I don't mean like Google Maps. I mean like old maps, right? And why do I say that, right? It's because when we're talking about old maps, right, it's like a lot of times they'll have things in there that are from the past, right? That are like if they pass by something and it says like, oh, hey, like, there was a people living here, then they'll have that there, right? They'll have it mentioned in the map, right? Okay, so that's maps. Surveying. There are 3 different ways of surveying: pedestrian, aerial, and geophysical. Pedestrian is literally just walking back and forth. Aerial is exactly how it sounds. It is using either a helicopter or an airplane to go over a certain area. And then geophysical is using technology to see buried remains, right? Using geophysical technology, if you guys are familiar with like battleships and sonar technology, it's kind of like that, right? Where basically what you do is you use a machine, and it kind of sends out these like little waves, and if the waves bounce back, it means there's something in the ground that you can look at, and then you can dig it up. But if it doesn't bounce back, then it means there's nothing in there. Okay. Let's see. Geographic information systems. So geographic information systems are very interesting because they're a database with a map-based interface. It's basically Google Maps, right? But for archaeology. So that's what that is. All right. Yeah. And some of the strengths and weaknesses of these methods, pedestrian is basically that it's slow and you can cover not that much ground. However, you get good detail, right? Okay. So you get good detail, but you don't cover a lot of ground. Aerial, it's the opposite. You cover a lot of ground, but you don't, you don't get a lot of detail. Okay. Geophysical, actually, there's not a lot of disadvantages. It's just that it's expensive and hard to maintain. Okay. And geographic information systems, well, if it's not there, it's gonna be missed. Essentially, it's gonna not be found out by you. Okay. All right, let's move on. So, how to study sites. Excavation of a site consists of the systemic uncovering of an archaeological remains through careful removal of the matrix. Excavation, no matter how careful, is always destructive, right? Excavation, basically the digging up of archaeological records, is always destructive. It's never not destructive, okay? and that is why documentation must be careful and thorough. Recording of the sites includes a three-dimensional grid system. A stratigraphic and stratigraphic excavation is basically digging layers so that it's even more careful. So basically what happens when you dig something up, you dig it in like a very, very predictable fashion so that you can go back and do it again. But also on top of that, you need to make sure to take a bunch of pictures and write down a bunch of things, because who knows, it might not last until when you go back to the lab or whatever. Okay. All right. Moving on. Categorizing. Cataloging involves classifying an object shape, material, and function. Assemblages are groups of artifacts and features from a particular time and place in a site. Archaeological cultures are constructed by grouping similar assemblages from many sites. This is used to map similarities and differences across space, may be mistakenly assumed to represent a real social group. All right, so now, this is interesting, right? So things are put together to represent certain societies. That's pretty straightforward, right? But the thing is sometimes it is not accurately put together. Then what, right? Because it might be, if you look at the difference between 100 years in the ground, it doesn't seem that different. So let's say there's a little bit of an earthquake. Let's say there's a mudslide or something where the stuff, comes together, even though not supposed to be together. Then you have an assemblage that doesn't represent the right time, right? So that's also a thing you have to be careful of. Okay. All right. So full circle. So archaeology is largely about understanding our past. What are some of the obvious difficulties that arise in trying to investigate the past, right? And some of the obvious things is that you don't know if what you're finding is accurate or not, right? A lot of times things may seem like they're from the same time period, but they're not. They may seem like they're used for one thing, but they're not, right? Who knows if this thing's a really big cup or a really heavy hat? Who knows, right? And of course, the last thing is preservation, right? Preservation, because of those three factors of preservation, you don't know whether certain things existed in the past or they didn't, right? So think about like all these biocompostable things. Like let's say we can convert completely to what are they called? Biodegradable straws next year, right? The whole country. And then after that, a nuclear bomb hits us, we all die. Now, according to the records, right, let's say it's the year 5000, after the year 2020, there were no plastic straws. They didn't have straws. Is that an accurate assessment? No, it's that we were using biodegradable straws. Because it biodegrades, because it decomposed into the ground, we don't know whether or not they had straws. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's what makes archaeology difficult. All right. So please make sure to read all the lectures. I'm sorry, to watch all the lectures. Please make sure to read the material. Please make sure to review the PowerPoint, and make sure to definitely get your quiz and reflection at the end of this week. If you have any questions, just shoot me an email at raymond.fong@kbcc.cuny.edu.